Zombies, zombies, zombies. They are everywhere. Not literally, of course, because we'd probably be screwed. Or would we? I'll get to that point. But what I mean is that every time you flick on a film or TV show these days, you never seem to be too far from a shambling corpse. You boot up a video game and there they are. Steam is just littered with games with dead, dying or zombie in the title. I mean, it's riddled with these resurrected gits. Sometimes I'll give them credit, they try to be a little bit creative and they give them another name. I mean, come on Fallout, I know you called them ghouls, but they're still bloomin' zombies. Now, for a while it seemed like we were oversaturated with those undead, but once again it feels like they are on an upwards trend. So if there are so many films, games, books, series, God knows what, with the dead in them, it can't just be me that's obsessed with zombies. I mean, we must love them, not in the sense that you'd invite them over for dinner, as we'd probably be on the menu rather than that nice risotto we prepared. Now, most people who know me know that I love a game or film set in the apocalypse, especially the zompocalypse, but zombies are my nightmare. Now, I know I sound like I'm going to talk figuratively, but I actually mean completely literally. 2 nights ago, before making this video, I had my latest zombie-related nightmare. I woke up in a panic in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, and over the years I've had so many of these nightmares, and while they all start off very differently, they end in a similar conclusion. I get bit, and just as the horde is about to consume and devour me, I wake up. It is terrifying, and it sounds not too dissimilar to a game cycle on Project Zomboid. Now, please do tell me that I'm not the only grown man that has nightmares about zombies. It sounds kind of pathetic if I am. I mean, maybe you're there laughing at me and thinking, no, I have nightmares that are much more grounded in reality. I have nightmares about things like loot boxes, or what EA's going to do with Dead Space, or the next franchise they decide to resurrect, or the current state of AAA gaming, or the homogeneous shake and bake format of every single Marvel film these days. Maybe that's what you have nightmares about. I mean, why don't you let me know what your nightmares are in the comments below and we can analyse them like amateur Freuds. That sounds completely safe. Nothing could go wrong there. But seriously, after that initial statement about zombies being my nightmare, you would be forgiven for imagining that I would do everything I possibly could to try and avoid anything related to these stinking, biting menaces. But no. In truth, I seem hell-bent on consuming as much zombie-related media as I possibly can. In fact, when I made my video about what makes Project Zomboid perfect, I was surprised at just how much undead-related content I'd actually digested. Games, films, TV shows, anime, you name it, it was on a massive list. But all of that got me thinking, if they have such a massive impact on me to the point where I have nightmares, why am I so obsessed with them? And in short, why do we love the zombie apocalypse? Okay, so after doing a fair bit of research, I came to the conclusion that the reason most people love the zombie apocalypse is quite simple. The zombie apocalypse offers an end of the world that is plausible, where most of us think that we could survive. I mean, not only survive, but actually thrive. And that for me is the long and the short of it. But before we get to that conclusion of why we love the zombie apocalypse, we need to dive into why we think it's plausible to survive, and indeed the scenario is actually plausible as well. Now let's first talk about the zombies, or whatever you want to call them. Walkers, stinkers, empties, ghouls, you name it, they've been called everything. We need to define them. Now, when I think of zombies, I think about the Romero classic. They're slow-moving and one bite and you're dead. And those are the zombies that I'll be considering when talking about the zombie apocalypse throughout this video. Runners or thinking zombies are only really brought into the media when things are getting a bit stale. But even then, many of these points that I'm going to make still very much apply. Now, in most of the films or TV shows, zombies aren't commonly the biggest threat. I mean, look at The Walking Dead. Sure, in the initial phases, yeah, they usually are. It's while the world ends and there's panic and confusion. No one knows what's going on. Are they zombies? Are they just infected? Are they ill? Can they be saved? And yes, that drama does last a little bit longer if those buggers can run. But after a while, those things settle down and they become more of a kind of side note, part of the scenery, the backdrop of the world. In short, TV shows like The Walking Dead aren't necessarily set in the zombie apocalypse, they're set against it. And later on, and after that initial chaos, as things become the new normal, people build walls, they find shelter, and they barricade themselves in. And the ones who get that far are usually going to survive for a while, because that initial stage is the part that roots out the vast majority of people, including, if that happened in real life, I have to say, probably myself. I have no doubt that I could survive in that end phase behind the walls. It's the getting there that would be the problem. I would probably get bit helping an old lady off a bus or stand on a nail and die from tetanus. Hell, in my first playthrough of Project Zomboid, I died. Not from a bite, but by lacerating myself crawling through a broken window. I mean, oh dear. I am not Rick Grimes. I am that unlucky sap, the cop, the one that Rick didn't really like. He turned and Rick put a bullet in his head. That is me.
Didn't think much of him. Careless and dumb, but can't leave him like this.
And after that initial chaos completely calms down, the main threats in most of these films and TV shows are the other people. Most zombie tales are stories of either people undermining people or people undermining themselves through stupidity, and inevitably then they end up dead at the hands of zombies, or actually rather the teeth. The point is that zombies aren't usually the main threat. In most media, they are slow moving and they're only dangerous in numbers. To make them more scary, and it often works, we put them in confined spaces, or if we really want to spice things up, we add some cheap jump scares by making them do some cardio. The thing is, in reality, survivors would probably avoid those confined spaces. They would most likely stay in open places with large fields of vision. They would live in cleared buildings surrounded by walls, and it would render the odd zombie or two, well, pretty much inconsequential. It's when they're in numbers that really causes the issue. Now, look at The Walking Dead for this. The real threats are most definitely the other survivors. There's the Governor, there's Negan, and there's Alpha, while our heroes, if you can call them that, the survivors, have lived in relative safety for a while in places like Alexandria, the prison, and Hilltop. It goes on and on and on. We look at these end results, we look at places like Alexandria and the prison, and we see relative safety and think, well, that's a world that we could live in. It's why so many times, and The Walking Dead is a perfect example of this, they have to destroy that safe space and move them on just to keep it fresh. Because that period of post-apocalypse, post-chaos, where we learn to live with it, it's a bit boring. It's just like, oh, well, what are we going to do today? Oh, we'll stay in the walls, we'll grow some food, and we'll have a chat. But then the obvious question is, why would we want to survive in that world? I mean, not why would we want to survive? I mean, why do we want the world to get to that state? Why do we want the world to end? And I will get to that later on in the video. But first, I want to talk about what zombies truly are. Because if they're not dangerous, which makes them sound like a terrible monster, why do we love films and games that incorporate them? Now, at no point am I going to say that zombies aren't scary. They totally are. But it's more about what they represent than the monster themselves. So let's compare them to things like werewolves and vampires. Now, werewolf lore in most films or books revolve around one day in the lunar cycle, a full moon, that a person will become this kind of feral creature that hunts and kills. The thing about that is, though, that on the other days of the month, you maintain relative humanity. I mean, sure, you've got this inconvenient state once a month, but effectively you retain some of what you are. And hell, even in some TV shows like Grimm, they become your best friend. Or you get good at basketball and become popular in Teen Wolf. And then there are vampires. Now, once you get bit, yep, you gain a bloodthirsty lust and you can't go to the beach and sit in your bikini anymore. Well, in most of the films I've seen, I mean, in Twilight, you just seem to glisten in the sun. I mean, oh, for flip's sake. On a side note, Twilight was actually fanfiction inspired by 50 Shades of Grey or vice versa. I can't remember which one came first, but this is actually a point of fecal matter inspiring fecal matter. I mean, glistening vampires. Why? But the point about these creatures is, even though these inconveniences are there, they're quite often portrayed as these highly intelligent, manipulative creatures that often maintain the memories of the person that came before. In short, as a vampire, you maintain some elements of your humanity. The same cannot be said for zombies. While it might be inconvenient to become a werewolf or a vampire and not be able to go to the beach, you would not want to be that. That is not what you would want to be because there is nothing of you left. In short, zombies represent death. They represent finality. Vampires, on the other hand, represent immortality. Immortality is something that most of us actually want. Well, actually, strangely, the theory of immortality making vampires scary is another one that I'll leave for another day, but basically, there is a benefit to becoming a vampire and there are zero benefits to becoming a zombie. That is why they're scary, but I said it's about what they represent. Zombies represent death. One bite and you're dead. One bad decision and you're dead. One bad conflict with another survivor and you are, surprise surprise, dead. And in my video about Project Zomboid, I said that the life cycle of a zombie apocalypse pretty much mirrors our own life cycle. Now, of course, in our own lives, or seriously I hope not, we don't have flesh-eating monsters. But what we do have is a beginning, a middle and an end. We're born, we live, we die. The zombie apocalypse represents that perfectly. You're born into this new world, you survive from day to day, making the most of it, until we ultimately die. And what do we become when we die? Well, we pretty much become that in both cases, except in normal life, we're not moving. Well, I seriously hope not. Zombies, yet again, are us when we die. We don't become vampires. We don't become werewolves. We become rotting, stinking corpses. It is bleak, but I'm sorry, my friends, it is true. It's terrifying that zombies themselves symbolize death and the zombie apocalypse symbolizes our life cycle. Now, I'm not saying that in our lives we need to be out there surviving person versus person, watching out for people with baseball bats or hiding out in a mall, but what I'm effectively saying is that there is an element of resonance. On top of that, there is something called the uncanny valley theory that makes zombies even more scary. Now, I'm going to talk about this theory more in a later video, but simply put, when you look at a zombie, you can tell that it's human. Sort of. Almost. But subconsciously, you know it's not quite right. Something is off. It's human, but it's not. Which actually unnerves us and we feel uncomfortable seeing them. And all of that kind of summarises the uncanny valley theory and it tells us why they're scary and unnerving. But I think the whole love of the zombie apocalypse goes deeper than that. Because when zombies come, they don't just leave the place looking quite nice. They bring with them the apocalypse. So what about the apocalypse? Why are we so fascinated by it? Well, I think that it's twofold. I said at the start of this video that people find it quite a plausible existence, a plausible way that the world will end. Now, every day on the news we hear things about nuclear threats, new viruses, riots, protests, strikes, death, destruction, chaos every day. I always find it quite entertaining that the news starts off by saying good evening and then proceeds to tell you why it isn't. Effectively, to my mind, it's come to the point where our brains can process this idea of an apocalypse far easier than it can process the idea of utopia, which is really, really sad. But basically, the news gears us up for the idea that the apocalypse is coming. A utopian society, one like in something like Star Trek, it kind of seems far less plausible than a wasteland in which we're fighting for our very own lives, and that is really tragic. It's a tragic mindset to have. There's a wonderful line in The Matrix that says people couldn't process perfection, a perfect world, so they had to create the imperfect world, which brings me on to my final point. And because our brains see it as plausible based on input materials like the news, the zombie apocalypse and all apocalyptic media has a secondary function. It can aid our education. Now, on a personal note, at the start of the COVID pandemic, way before anybody started panic buying and the lockdown had just started in Wuhan, my brain told me it would be a good idea to buy supplies. I went to the local shop and rather than buy 1 tin or 2 tins of something, I bought 3 or 4 tins and I started to stock up very slowly. I wasn't panicking, I wasn't panic buying, but I wanted to make sure I had enough food just in case. And a few weeks later, about a month later, when everybody else was starting to panic, I was at home with lots of tins of beans, happy as I could be. Seriously, I have never eaten that many tins of beans before in my life. I mean, if I never see another tin of beans again, oosh. But actually, what happened is, I remembered the words of Tobias from the first season of Fear the Walking Dead, and he talked about when civilization ends, it ends quickly.
Communications will fail because no one's there to manage the servers. The electrical grid will collapse for the same reason. It's all gonna go to hell. And that's what they don't get. When civilization ends, it ends fast.
An apocalyptic TV show informed my decision making on a real life. And in a way, he was right. A few weeks after I'd got my tins of beans, there were news reports of people fighting over toilet paper. I mean toilet paper for flip's sake. But then something else happened shortly after. What happened is that my elderly members of my family, they hadn't really seen the warning signs. The things in Wuhan, the lockdowns, it didn't really trigger anything. Perhaps they hadn't seen enough zombie-related media. And when things got a little desperate for a while, they couldn't get delivery slots, or they were too scared to go to the shops. They did something that was quite interesting that relates to their mentality. They started to ration their food a little bit. Now, I'm not saying that they were in any serious risk of starvation, or I'm trying to make this more dramatic, but a wartime mentality kicked in that they had learnt from their parents. Their parents during World War II had learnt to ration food. They had passed on this information like Tobias, or the amount of zombie media had passed on to me. And what happened next? Well, I turned up to their houses with bags of food. Mainly beans, but actually I did have some soup and some mac and cheese, so I did have 3 different things to eat. I felt like Rick Grimes with my tins of beans. Now, a lot of these films we watch are exaggerated versions of what could happen. I don't honestly think the zombie apocalypse is going to happen, I really hope not. And many people discount them as alarmist or implausible. But sometimes our perspectives change. Now, look at a film starring Matt Damon called Contagion. It's a film about a virus that threatens humanity. Now, before the pandemic, it wasn't really that well known. I'd certainly never seen it nor heard about it. Most critics said it was okay, but a little bit far-fetched. It was, in short, in their opinion, implausible. In this film, it's a deadly virus that spreads very quickly, and to combat the virus, they introduce ideas of social distancing and lockdowns. Oh wow, that sounds familiar. And then what happened during the real-life pandemic? Well, the film became one of the top-viewed movies on Netflix. Interesting. And our possible learning from these kind of films doesn't just stop at what to do during these events, but we can also see how people would react in the apocalypse, the psychology of survivors. While most of us believe or wouldn't want to become someone like Negan or the Governor or Alpha, you can see on a base level how people potentially act in intense situations. And on top of that, we as the viewer, we can learn how to survive, because after all, most of us imagine living on in this world and not getting wiped out in the early stages. Well, apart from me, who I think I've resigned myself to the fate of that guy. And then, bringing it back to the real life, we can already see people who are predicting an apocalypse. People that are prepping. They call them preppers, right? They're building bunkers underground and they're stocking up on food. They're learning survival techniques that they will need in what they believe is an inevitable post-apocalyptic wasteland that is coming. Now, most of us don't think that zombies are going to be walking around eating you, but the way in which the world is geared, some kind of post-apocalyptic scenario seems to land far more plausibly with a lot of people. But I'm not saying that most people want that to happen. People would prefer safety. They don't want to live in a bunker or in a wasteland. And I certainly don't think people want flesh-eating zombies. I mean, I don't. But there seems to be a feeling that people are kind of stuck. Or they want a change. Just looking at YouTube, there are a wealth of videos about change your job, self-help books about, paying bills, making money, becoming happier. Then there are others that are more direct, talking about boring jobs or toxicity of society. The sheer volume and impact of these self-help books and videos suggests that many among us are at least discontented. Now again, I'm not saying that they want the zombie apocalypse to happen, and they don't even want the apocalypse to happen. But what many people want out there is change. They want a shift. The zombie apocalypse or any kind of apocalyptic event represents a dramatic change, a resetting of the scales. The lives described in the initial phases of these self-help books are seen as bad. Full of bills and toxic jobs, they would be gone. Those lives would end. The bills that we pay would be no more. An apocalyptic event is symbolic of a chance at change. Many seem to watch and enjoy the apocalyptic shows because it offers a glimpse of who they could reinvent themselves as in the new world. And we have a new chance to rebuild and grow, and there it is. That is the final reason I think that people love this type of media. It's hope. They end up rebuilding. They band together, they plant new crops, they create new civilizations, and they do, yes, stay behind walls and have a chat. And new societies make a new world that we want to live in. It's almost describing a perfect existence. Which is ironic because I said earlier that utopia doesn't resonate, so why doesn't it? Well, a utopian society, as wonderful as it would be, doesn't seem to offer this because it doesn't seem plausible to get there. It requires new technology, it requires cooperation, it requires a fundamental shift of our mentality of human beings. It requires massive advancement. Getting to that point of being a utopian society seems implausible because human beings can't imagine a world in which we cooperate fully. And getting to that post-apocalyptic world after the zombie apocalypse, that sense of hope, that wonderful world somehow seems earned. In a utopian world, we may not feel we earn that change because we probably weren't the ones that created the new technology. So there you have it. On the face of it, zombies are fun and thrilling and scary based in a bleak and horrible world. But the reason the zombie apocalypse seems to resonate is because of its symbolism. Zombies represent our death. The zombie apocalypse represents our life cycle, and the apocalypse on the whole is a learning experience which comes with hope in showing you what life could be like after a change. And I reiterate, most people on the planet do not want this scenario, but it seems that they do want a change about something in their current status, and that is something the zombie apocalypse offers. Let me know in the comments below if you agree or disagree with my assessment of why people love the zombie apocalypse. But from me today, all it leaves me to say is thank you very much for watching, and this is Roy McCoy, out.